discussion. So next slide, please. Yeah, this is, the context of this webinar on climate health is obviously, and the context of actually most what we have been doing in HERA. I will present the HERA a little bit later, but is about basically the Green Deal and the climate law that and the climate perspective of the European Union. And this is slide summarizes actually some of the major plans and objectives and strategies in the Green Deal. Of course, they include biodiversity, farm to fork, zero pollution, circular economy, but obviously climate change is a major input. So what HERA focuses on is on the nexus between environmental change, in particular here climate change, and health. Next slide. And the aim of HERA, which is not the HERA you are hearing about in the agency, the new agency that Europe has created. For some reason, it has the same logo. It's Health and Environment Research Agenda. This is an H2020 coordination and support action project. Our mission was to develop a European research and innovation agenda on environment, climate, and health, covering key strategic research and policy aspects. And obviously, climate change is one of the major aspects of HERA's work. So we have actually now written almost final agenda for research in different fields with major research goals and with some detail, I have to say. And we are now opening this agenda for public consultation and for comments and input from whoever would like to give us some input. So this is really the most important part of the message here is you can find, you can visit the HERA site and you go to agenda and you can see the public consultation there and you can comment. There's a form where you can give your comment, and we really would appreciate that, because based on those comments, we will add the specific chapters based on those comments or eventually make some changes in the agenda. So your input is really valuable, and if you could do it within I think until sometime in October, it will be really great for us. So next slide. That's now the presentation of today's webinars on climate change and health. We have had other webinars earlier on other plans and strategies of the EU, but today it's on climate change and health. We are really happy to have 4 speakers on very diverse aspects actually of climate change and health. Lisbeth Hall from RIVM will present the impacts of climate change on health, taking Netherlands as an example. Jérôme Boissier will speak more specifically on a tropical disease and its relationship to climate health. He's from Université de Perpignan in France. And Ariana Zeka from Brunel University in London will be talking about migration and social inequalities linked to climate change. And Martin Herrmann from the German Alliance on Climate Change and Health in Germany on transformational change and climate change. So this is the program, this is the agenda today. And I do not want to spend more time. I would like to give the floor now immediately to Lisbeth from RIVM on the impacts of climate change and health. So Lisbeth, if you can upload your presentation.
Yes, thank you very much.
Just a second, you can, obviously, if you need to ask some specific question on each talk, you can do it in the chat or raise your hand and we can give you the floor. Those are specific questions, but keep in mind that at the end, we have a general discussion where you have also the chance to give your opinion and comments. So sorry, Lou, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for having me today. And I'd like to kick off this webinar with a look at the impacts of climate change on health, a brief overview, and then look at some of the work we're doing in the Netherlands on quantifying these impacts. So if we look at the impacts on the planet, obviously the more weather extremes, sea level rise, rising temperatures, and in this diagram you see on the second ring the changes to exposures. For example, we're being more exposed to extreme weather through changes in the distribution of vectors and plants to higher altitudes, higher latitudes. We're getting more exposure to these vectors like ticks and mosquitoes, and also to plant allergens. There are also exposures to waterborne diseases. And then on the outer ring, you see what impact this is having on our health. So, for example, we're expecting more cardiovascular disease, more respiratory diseases such as allergies or asthma, also more vector-borne diseases, waterborne diseases, but also the impacts on mental health are increasingly getting attention. For example, the effects of having an extreme weather event, like having flooding, experiencing flooding, but also kind of the existential threat of climate change is causing some anxiety amongst especially the young people. So what are we doing in the Netherlands? We've been looking at trying to quantify the effects of different scenarios, the different heating scenarios, and we're doing this based on two of our Dutch Met Office scenarios. So one of them is more a lower end scenario, similar to the trajectory we're on if we're sticking to the agreements we made in Paris. So that's similar to the RCP 4.5 scenario. And the other trajectory is the Dutch W scenario. So that's if we don't take any mitigation measures. So that's very much a high-end emission scenario. And the difference, for example, between those scenarios in terms of temperature increase, you'll see, for example, a difference of some 1 degree in 2050 in terms of temperature increase and 2 degrees towards the end of the century. So based on those two scenarios, we've been looking at temperature-related mortality. And in the Netherlands, we have like a minimum mortality temperature of around 16 to 18 degrees. That's what you see in the top graph. And above that, you get heat-related mortality, which from 25 degrees onwards rises quite steeply. And below that, we get the cold-related mortality. And obviously, this is also some age groups are more vulnerable. So obviously, the elderly are more vulnerable to both the heat-related as cold-related mortality. And we calculated this using the methodology developed by the multi-country, multi-city collaborative network. And we looked, if we look at these scenarios, what does that, what's the difference? So we see if we carry on with our current climate policy, we'll get fewer heat-related deaths as the century progresses than if we go on that high-end trajectory. So, and in 2050, with the high end, if we're not doing anything, we'd expect some 1,400 more deaths per year. And towards the end of the century, that's really increasing to more than 4,000 deaths compared to the trajectory we're on. Obviously, in the high-end scenario, we're having fewer cold-related deaths. But as you can see, especially towards the end of the century, the heat-related deaths, the increase in heat-related deaths is more than the decrease in cold-related deaths. So there's a net, effect of more mortality with climate change, and obviously with the high-end trajectory. We also looked at skin cancer. Here, we're looking at more the indirect effects of climate change. Through climate change, we're getting more warm and sunny weather in the Netherlands, and we're seeing that as temperatures increase, people are more likely to be outside, especially in the milder climates of the Netherlands. So people are more likely to be more recreation, more exposure to UV radiation, and this causes more skin cancer. So it's very much a behavioral impact here, behavioral effect. As you can see on the right, we've had a really big increase in skin cancer in the last decades. It's also to do with the demographics and aging population, but a lot of it's to do with our behavior. And we're assuming with climate change, like I said, more warm weather, more exposure. So this is very tentative, and we really need to kind of unravel the contributions of all these different things. But as a preliminary look, you can see that in 2050, if we don't have, if the climate stays the same, we will already have a big leap in skin cancer, in disability-adjusted life years. You can see it's almost double the amount. But then again, you can see the difference in the scenarios. So with the high-end scenario, the W scenarios, we'll be seeing more higher burden of disease, and especially increasing again towards the end of the century, that will double in increase in terms of if you compare it to the lower end scenario. We also looked at pollen allergies. We can see that in the Netherlands, our growing season has really increased by about 20 days in the last century, and we're expecting in the future it will also continue to grow. So it will start earlier in the year, it will end later. Probably plants and grass will have more flowerings through the season, and therefore we're expecting the hay fever symptoms to get worse, and more symptoms, and perhaps be more exacerbated because more plants will be flowering at the same time. It's difficult to get a handle on this because the prevalence of hay fever and medication use is underestimated. People tend not to go to their GP. If they do, it will be registered, but people will buy over-the-counter medication which isn't registered. Whereas if it's prescribed, it will be. So we do have some data, but it's very much underestimated. So it's very difficult to quantify what the effects are now and in the future. We're also seeing some new species arriving, new allergenic species like ragweed, and that's a kind of natural spread because of the warming. But also people are, for example, buying olive trees these days, which wouldn't have survived a Dutch winter years ago, but now they do, and that's a very allergenic pollen. Through looking at the literature and some of the scenarios on sensitization to ragweed, we've managed to do an estimate of current burden of hay fever of some 400 dahlias per year due to ragweed, and there's been some scenario work which suggests that that will be about a 50% increase with our current climate policy around 2050. Unfortunately, we didn't have any data on that high-end scenario. So what have we learned in this? We can see that obviously climate change is already having an impact on health. That's going to increase in the future. And if we all do what we've agreed to do under the Paris Agreement, this will slow this increase in health effects, and the benefits of this policy will increase as obviously as the century progresses. And obviously if we do more, that will slow the increase even further. We've also found a lot of gaps in our knowledge. For example, often in the current burden of disease is not clear, as with hay fever. Exposure effect relationships are not clear yet. And also things like the combined exposures, if you have, for example, a heat wave and ozone, for example, a lot of ground level ozone pollution, and for example, pollen, then what does that mean for the health effects? So we need to tease that out as well in future research. Obviously, adaptation is very necessary in the meantime to manage and minimize the effects. And lastly, I'd just like to mention some work of my colleagues on the health co-benefits in the Netherlands, of the measures we're taking in the Netherlands to mitigate climate change. We're expecting some about 20,000 fewer loss to health and life in dahlias in 2050 due to the measures we're taking at the moment. And that's in particular due to reductions in air pollution and into noise pollution. So that's my story. We have a lot of information on our website, and also the reports that this is based on. There's a link here, unfortunately in Dutch, but Google Translate does a great job these days. So thank you very much. That was my presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for keeping the time. It's really interesting. I'm not sure I can see an immediate question. I may have one just as a follow-up. Actually, you alluded to it at the end. I mean, clearly all these diseases are multifactorial, and it's probably, tough to identify, the contribution of this heat or whatever. I mean, anything related to climate change. So how do you think we can solve this issue one way or another?
Well, there is a lot of attribution research going on at the moment. So recently there was a study on the attribution of climate change to heat waves with that MCT collaborative network, and I think it's around 30%, a third is attributed to climate change. But I think we'll see a lot more of this in the coming years. But you're absolutely right; it's multifactorial. We need to tease out the different elements. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Great. Maybe we could discuss it also at the end. So thank you very much. And now we will shift to the second talk by Jérôme Boissier from University of Perpignan in France, with a focus on schistosomiasis, tropical disease.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes. Perfect. As Robert said before, I choose to present you an example, a case study of the of the effect of global change and the climate change and migration of humans on the emergence of tropical disease in the south of Europe. And I focus my talk on the importance to use the One Health approach to decipher this kind of emergence. First of all, I think I have to say some words on schistosomiasis. Schistosomiasis is considered as a neglected but not anymore tropical disease now. This parasitic disease is a second parasitic disease after malaria in terms of morbidity and mortality. You can see that the epidemiological data are at least a little bit impressive, with several hundred people, millions risk of infection, and you can see that we, unfortunately, we have 200,000 deaths every year, mainly children, and the majority are in Africa. This parasite is considered a parasite with complex life cycle. These schistosome parasites are worms. These worms live in the bladder of infected patients. When the patient urinates in the fresh water, some eggs are released. The free larval stage is released from the eggs. This larval stage infects the mollusk vector, and after some weeks, thousands and thousands of sarcoria are emitted by the snail, and this larval stage infects the definitive host actively through the skin. Thus, after this brief introduction, we can go directly to the emergence of schistosomiasis in Corsica. The two first cases has been diagnosed in 2013 in Germany and in France. After that, a big nationwide screening was done, and we have identified 106 cases with certainty of infection in Corsica. And modeling estimation show that we have certainly more than 300 people infected in Corsica. After that, the river was closed, and surprisingly, the contamination resumed several years after the first year. It's important to notice that each infection concerns a given year. What I mean is that in 2016, for instance, the two patients has never been before in Corsica and has never been in Africa. Thus, this infection in 2016 in Corsica, and it's not a problem of diagnostic. After that, after that, the autochthonous schistosomiasis became a notified disease in France, and the last infection we observed was in the other river than the first river. The parasite jumped from the Cabo River to the Solenzara River. After that, we decided to decipher a little bit the genetic of the parasite, and we have identified that, surprisingly, this parasite is not a typical human parasite, Schistosoma hematobium, but a cross between human parasite and an animal parasite, Schistosoma bovis. This parasite is a livestock parasite or a rodent parasite. We also have identified that this parasite certainly come from West Africa, and with a high probability to Senegal as origin. The big concern to decipher this epidemic was to understand how is it possible for this parasite to be maintained from year to year in our latitude, because it's impossible for the larval stage to live more than 10 or 12 hours in the environment. To this, we decided to do a One Health approach, looking at the environment, human and animals. First, concerning human host, we look for the human behavior to look for precise transmission site. We took either a picture from tourist families having infected in the Cabo River, or testimonies of locals infected in the Cabo River. And we saw that we have two distinct transmission sites with about 1 kilometer distance between both. And you see that these two sites are situated in this part of the river. The site number 5 concerned infection in 2015. Here you have the sea. You can also see that it's really, really beautiful river, and highly frequented, 3,000 to 5,000 people every day. And as I said before, the parasite jumped from the Cabo River here to the Solenzara River, 20 kilometers in the north. We also observe a big concern in terms of diagnostic, because to have confirmation, we have to do 3 different tests. 66% of patients were asymptomatic. The median of diagnostic was 7 months after exposition. For instance, if you say me, if we have a patient infected last summer, I will say to wait for April or May to know if we have parasite in the Cabo River or Solenzara River. Lastly, a big concern is also the fact that the parasite is a long-lived parasite. You can take an efficient treatment, but if you are not treated, the parasite can live 10 years in your body. Thus, human host can be reservoir host. Concerning animal, we diagnosed several thousand of animals from farms, cows, sheep, goats, and we did not find any positive animal in the field. But we wonder if our diagnostic test is a homemade diagnostic test, is not a commercial diagnostic test, is really have really good fiability. We also trapped some rodents. As you see, we focused our trapping in the different sites known to be transmission site, and we found only 2 positive rats. Thus, the role of the rodents in the transmission is uncertain. What some is a little bit funny is, we know perfectly what is the host spectrum of Schistosoma bovis in Africa. We know that Schistosoma bovis can infect camels, but of course we don't have any camels in Corsica. But for instance, we have mufflon, and mufflon is like a wild sheep, and we don't know if changing the environment is also changing host. We don't know if the mufflon can be reservoir host for schistosomiasis. Finally, concerning the environment, of course, we have the snail vector in Corsica. This historically, we know the repartition of the snail. The snail is present in the Mediterranean coast, Italy, France, Spain, Portugal, Greece. We found plenty of snails in the river during the first field mission, and now we have developed some environmental DNA tool to detect snails in river, and we are ongoing project to detect the parasite in the river. After that, we have done some experiments in the lab to try to infer the resistance of infected mollusks to resist over a winter season. We have to remember that the parasite is a tropical parasite. For that, we have measured the temperature of the Cabo River for 1 year. You can see that in the summer, it's like a swimming pool. And in the winter, the temperature can go to 8 degrees. We have performed some experiment to test the survival of infected mollusks, and you can see that at 4 degrees, this is too much. And the mollusk die. At 24, this is normal development for the parasite, hitting the snail and producing sarcoria. Thus, the mollusk died too. But you can see that at temperature corresponding to winter season, the mollusk can resist. Thus, yes, you can imagine that the parasite can resist over a winter season, but certainly not 2 winter seasons. It's not possible due to the duration of the life of a mollusk. But at the end, we are certain that the problem in Corsica are humans. We have human reservoir hosts in Corsica. First, I want to thank all my partners in this story, partners from animal health, from human health, from ecology and environment, and of course in the center, all my colleagues from the University of Perpignan or the CNRS. And just I want to thank you for your attention. And of course, you imagine that I had just 10 minutes to pitch the schistosomiasis emergence in Corsica. If you want to learn more, you can flash the code and you can upload all the publication on this story. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Jérôme, for this talk, excellent talk on One Health, with the One Health perspective. Reminds me that, in fact, in the HERA agenda, all these overarching concepts such as One Health and planetary health and global health, we believe they are extremely valuable and relevant, and we encourage research in these different fields with a complementary perspective, as you have shown, both in human, in animal, in the environment. So this is a perfect illustration, and I think, and thank you very much for that. And it fits really well with some of the suggestions and goals we have mentioned in our agenda. Okay, if there are no other questions, I will give the floor to our third speaker, Dr. Ariana Zeka from Brunel University in London, on a completely different subject, which is also extremely relevant, on migration, social inequalities linked to climate change. So the floor is yours. It's maybe not in presentation mode until now. Okay. Yeah, on the left, on the right, sorry, below, yeah, down. You're getting close.
There I am. I wanted to magnify the screen if that was possible, but I can't.
You cannot put it in presentation mode. It's really close to where you're. Oh, it's to the right, a little bit more to the right.
Yes. Yeah. Am I there?
To the zoom scale, the zooming scale down.
Okay.
Down there.
Sorry, I'm not able to find it. Okay. No. All right. Okay, let me I'll close this.
Yeah.
It's apologies for this.
No problem. Take your time.
I think I've gone into the wrong mode actually for this. For some reason, I'm not able to do the full screen.
The icon right next to the zoom scale doesn't work.
But just click on slideshow.
Yeah,
that's slideshow.
Oh, found it. I found it. It was hiding under all the.
That's right.
Thank you very much. Apologies for this. Thank you very much for inviting me, and hopefully I'm not going to take that long, but I thought it will be important to touch upon some key issues related to migration, climate change, and social inequalities, and that's what I'll try to do within those 10 minutes. Migration itself, it's historically has been a human adaptive strategy to respond to different shocks. I mean, humans have migrated since early humans moved out of Africa due to natural shocks, such as, for example, or natural conditions, such as in search of warmer climates or cooler climates, or cyclic climate conditions for either for hunting or for food production, or the long-term changes of their habitats. Migration is also as a result of shocks that are related to conflict, and in majority due to conflict and war, persecution, economic hardships, resource security or lack of resource security, or loss of livelihood and habitability. And I think we're all now quite familiar with photos like this, almost, quite frequently in the media and the news. On the top is the Venezuelan migrants of the past, in the past years, and the map on the right shows their migration outside of Venezuela across the South Americas, and also in other countries. And other photos show Syrian migrants through the Balkans, or migrants trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea. what is the current state of knowledge? I mean, there is a lot of estimates about what is the impact of migration in populations. The UN Agency for Refugees estimates that by the end of 2020, there were about 82 million migrants, or 1 in every 95 people were forcibly displaced globally. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center in 2020 only estimates that there were 40 million new internal displaced migrants as a result of conflict or disasters across about 180 countries and territories. There are other estimates of the World Bank as zone, the Lancet Countdown also estimated a whole range. What is quite clear is that although there is still uncertainty in the numbers, and I think I on purpose made this slide with a lot of letters and quite small fonts, there's uncertainty in numbers. There is a clear upward trend of the numbers of migrants that will be impacted and will be forcibly displaced in the coming years and decades. And climate change will be a significant factor of human movement in those coming decades. And this is quite a recognized issue now internationally. Just going back to some of those numbers I just showed in a bit bigger font. Again, the UN Refugee Agency estimated by the end of 2020, 82 million forcibly displaced people worldwide. And as we can see in the graph on the right side, is in the last decades, these numbers almost have doubled in comparison to previous decades. In majority as a result of internally displaced, forcibly displaced people. So about 48 million of these displaced people are internally displaced or within their own countries, forced displacement. And 68% of the internationally displaced, so those the remaining 34 million, originate from only 5 countries. And these are Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. 35 million, about 42% of the 82 million, are children under 18 years of age, and about 1 million children were born as refugees between 2018 and 2020. And about 86% of these refugees are hosted in developing countries. About a third of them are hosted in least developed countries across the globe. So I think these statistics do show that the impacts are not equally across the globe of those who migrate and those who receive the migrants and where the migrants go. What is the link between climate change and migration nexus? Climate change can impact through climate-related processes such as sea level rise, and therefore loss of lands, salinization of agricultural land, which leads to food security and water security, desertification for the same, which they lead to resource security, and the growing water scarcity. But it's also climate impacts through climate-related events, and when there is now sufficient evidence to show that there is a link between climate and severity and potentially frequency of flooding, storms, landslide, and wildfires. And this is a graph which is taken by the International Disaster Database, and which shows the disasters for the last 50 years, natural disasters for the last few years. And the climate-related disasters such as floods, extreme weather, drought, extreme temperature, landslide, wildfire, seem to make the majority of these disasters, and they are increasing in the past 20 years. I think we're also familiar now with pictures like this. And again, going back to that statistic of the International Displacement Monitoring Center in 2020, only 40 million forced displaced across the globe. 30 million of these were climate and weather related, predominantly storms, cyclones, hurricanes, and floods. And I think there are pictures taken from Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico a couple of years ago, from Hurricane Matthew in Haiti, and just a very recent Guardian article showing the floods and the impacts across developing and the least developed countries, and also the wildfires in Greece this very recent summer. looking at the natural disaster-related internal displacements for the past 12 years, these are split now. I've split them by different regions of the world, and we can see that the impacts will be largely felt in absolute numbers, in tens of millions across South Asia, in particular in the Pacific, and an increase in numbers in Africa and the Middle East. While the numbers are not small in Americas and are in some ways in some increase in Europe and Central Asia. But what is very important to note in these graphs is that climate-related events are the ones that are causing the majority of these forced displacements, including floods, storms, extreme temperatures, wildfires. And migration itself is there are different typologies of migration, why people do migrate. This is just one of those typologies of migration, whether migrants are forced, such as the examples that we've seen, displaced due to conflict or natural disaster, voluntary because of conditions of poverty, nutrition, or even scarcity of resources. And also as a result of resettlements, as a result of loss or decline of their livelihoods. For example, indigenous tribes in Alaska or the small islands resettlement programs. But and also as part of a migration typology is immobility. Although we don't classify that as migration, people do not move. There are populations that are trapped as a result of conditions of poverty and an increase in poverty and as a result of loss and decline of livelihoods. And all of these in combination, there are interlinked health issues of related to those preconditions of migration, so those that condition the vulnerability of these populations, also during the migration process for those that move and after the migration process. And all of these listed here are not unlike each other. So each of those typologies of migration have very cross or overlapping health issues related. There are ways to understand, or there are different proposed models to understand the link between climate change and migration. One of these proposed models is through the Lancet countdown, where climate change is proposed and is mediating migration through an increase or increase in the frequency and severity of floods, heat waves, droughts, and fire, and as a result of loss of biodiversity. Other models of how climate change links to migration, as another model is proposed by Butler and Harley, for example, where migration is considered a tertiary impact of climate change through socioeconomic impacts. However, this is also linked to the secondary, so the biological, ecological impacts of climate change, such as changes in crop yields and impacts on nutrition and vector-borne distribution or water availability and quality, and we can put food in here and land as well. We have, as a team, attempted to also try to understand what are the key drivers of migration and how is climate change impacting those. And we understand, or we try to explain, that there are different drivers. So migration is a result of a combination of social, economic, political, demographic, and environmental drivers, and climate change as a risk multiplier of such drivers. But these drivers do actually contribute to the individual context and the vulnerability profile of those who decide to migrate, or those that are unable to migrate as loss of their vulnerability profile, and that leads to a migration decision. And we have also, and I'll conclude with this slide, we have also tried to see this climate change and migration nexus, the link, by trying to explore in a much more context and in almost like a zoomed version of the model that we have proposed in Malawi, and the results of this study are ongoing. are being analyzed. But in this model, we try to understand exactly what's happening in the population of Madai, which is highly agricultural based, very dependent on food as a resource security, and also in water, where 80% of the population is farm based and agricultural based, and one of the is a low income countries, or one of the least developed countries. So I would like to conclude in here with the fact that migration and climate change is a complex link. The nexus is a complex link, and it is through other drivers and mediating factors, such as we mentioned, social, economic, political, and environmental. But however, it is one of the key factors that might increase and will potentially increase migration numbers in the future as a result of climate change impacts. So I'd like to thank you very much for the time, and open to questions at the end of the session.
Thank you very much for this very interesting talk about migration. I mean, this is, I think you mentioned extreme weather, and we have all noticed this this summer, you know, how much extreme weather can be really bad in many of our countries. And the drivers of migrations are diverse, and this is something really complex, as you mentioned. And the impacts of increased migration are also quite critical in terms of politics and society. So yeah, this is really a very, very important issue. Okay, let's move now to the last talk of the day by Martin Herrmann from the German Alliance, Climate Change and Health, on transformational change in climate change. Martin?
Yes, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very excited to talk to you. I'm very happy to talk after three very informative presentations on the complexities and how kind of climate change is showing up in all different dimensions. And I just want to point to a few things before I go into my main talk on transformational change. I think when we discuss these issues, at least in Germany, it's very important to understand that until 2 years ago, the German health sector was sleeping to the threats that we have in front of us. And from conversations I've had with many other health professionals across Europe, this is similar patterns. So it's really important to understand that we are, as health professionals, as a health sector, we are only in the beginning of a learning curve. And at the same time, the health effects are mostly not understood with the climate scientists and the climate activists. They see it as a question of the environment, as a question of energy, as a question of traffic, and so on and so forth. They're not seeing it as a health issue. So this, when we started our alliance 4 years ago, this was our cause to change this. And in hindsight, fortunately, from the beginning, we were also focusing on strongly pointing out the necessity not only to develop knowledge, but to move into transformative action. Because it is very clear from the outside that we are in the process of destroying the habitability of our wonderful planet. And the examples have shown how devastating effects this already has today. I mean, the examples of migration is just one. We also have more wars and other things. We have much more hunger than we used to have. So it's a devastating effect. And it's, of course, clear that when you destroy the habitability of the planet, you destroy health in all effects. So that's what we have in front of us. I think we also all know that we have a certain time window of perhaps 10, 15 years where we still can intervene in a meaningful fashion. So I think that's very important to bear that in mind. Now, what is clear when you look at the kind of changes that we have in front of us, and that how it developed over the last 250 years in the way we have been doing business, in the way we relate to each other, in the way we treat our planet, that what we have in front of us is what is called the great transformation. What is a great transformation? It's a need for deep changes in all sectors, all regions, all levels. So this is kind of, you know, we have seen in the past, historians have described two other great transformations. One is from the hunters and gatherers to the settling and agriculture. The second was the Industrial Revolution. This time we have to make a shift to have a completely different relationship to nature, to be in line with nature, to really understand what it means to live on a planet and kind of nurture the planet on which we depend, because we depend on the planet. So this is a transformational need, and it is also clear that in a way, the biggest kind of barriers that I see with many politicians, with many doctors, with many scientists, that on one level, we know that we have to change and we have to make big changes. At the same time, it's very difficult to comprehend something like transformational change, or to understand yourself as also a transformational change agent. So this is what planetary health scholars call the imagination challenge. We cannot imagine how we would have to work together. And this is a field I've been working on for the last 30 years, and also in our corporations in Germany and across the planet. We work with a lot of scientists on this. So we work with Helmholtz, we work with Lancet Countdown, we work with Charité, to always make sure when they go to the public and when we work together that we take into account the transformational dimension. Just a few comments on main things that you need to bear in mind. When you look in any transformational challenge, and you look then in the fields and the science and kind of the people involved, what you will see is that there are technical and scientific issues and questions. And then there are social issues and social questions and questions of cooperation. It's a complexity we have on both sides, on the technical side, but also on the social side. There's also, if you look at these two dimensions, there are certain things where we quite well know what to do, kind of the science is clear. Also in some areas, it's clear how we have to cooperate. But the more complexity you have and the more urgent it is, also you have much more to deal with the unknown in all these areas. And now when you come to transformational question, what you see is that most scientists, most economists, most politicians, most citizens tend to stay and focus on what they are comfortable with and what they know about. And this leads to that normally we are not looking at the transformational challenge in front of us, but rather do more things where we feel comfortable to. This leads also to that most people don't see themselves as equipped or talented for transformational action, because it only can occur when you work in a different fashion together. And this is what I want to point to. The real challenge is the social complexity of the transformation paths we have in front of us. And within the social complexity, there's a question of how are we finding different ways of cooperating across boundaries, across sectors, across levels, across nations. How do we do that in a practical fashion around things that really matter? It's not enough to kind of get together and have a nice chat. It's about doing the things which are the most urgent and getting together with unusual companions to sort things out that we never tried to sort out, and to cooperate with people we would not think of to cooperate with, because that's exactly what it's taken if you want to take the challenge of the transformational journey we have in front of us serious. We need to leave our comfort zone. And I want to come back with a few comments to science. I think it's very important that we take this field serious, and I think everyone who works on the field of climate change and biodiversity needs to get a basic literacy in what transformation and action is about. It's not enough if you have read about transformation. You need to create areas where develops the skills that is needed to be a transformational change agent. And this is also a pledge or a plea for you in HERA, that you make this a priority and not just one of the things that are interesting on the sideline. It's really at the core what is in front of us for all scientists and all activists and all doctors in the next 10, 15 years, to learn about transformation, to practice transformation, to share what it will take. Because this is the only kind of, if you're not finding a way to move forward on the transformational path, we will not be able to make the necessary changes. So thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you for this plea for transformational change. I think we have discussed this a number of times in HERA, and it is on our top priorities. But let me make a small comment. When you know, at the start of your talk, you mentioned health, that not so many people were really aware that there's this important link between climate and health. This reminded me of, you know, when we had this COP21 in France, in the Paris, just before the Paris Agreement, we were asked at INSERM to have a sort of reflection on climate change and what we could do as a National Institute for Health. And we have written a small comment in the Lancet, which was entitled, "Can Health Save the Climate Change Negotiation?" Because we thought that if people get aware of the health impacts, maybe they will be a little bit even more involved and more interested in climate change. And that's really still true today, I think. And that's
I think it's very much true. It is also clear that health professionals have the highest reputation. If people understand that our health is threatened already today, not in the future, it is happening now. They are willing, if you have a very severe diagnosis, you are willing to invest, because that's the only thing that matters then. Yeah, and we need to understand that it is really the time to not look at can we afford it. We cannot afford to wait any longer. And I'm clear when we are able to mobilize the health professionals to play a stronger role in societies, this can be a tipping point for all what we have in front of us. I'm very convinced.
So one of the issues that we also have discussed in HERA is, this is a general plea for transformation change in the large perspective, but also make it a little bit more concrete as what is transformational change in a specific sector. For example, what would be transformational change in the health care sector, and what would be transformation change in the research field? I mean, is the way to do research different because of how should it be transformed? So I think this is important too, because some people do not clearly understand what is transformational change in practice. And see this.
So in practice, I give you a short answer. If you look in your field and look out in society, there are 2 or 3 really relevant questions. So when you take transformation serious, you focus on what is most relevant and also what is most difficult. The second is, when you look at this field, in order to make progress, you will have to reach out to other people, to other disciplines to make progress. So really start working together with them, not just to meet and share positions, but to really do joint work. We can only succeed if we have a breakthrough in cooperation. And the third one is we need to get kind of really go beyond the hierarchies we usually have, especially with these subjects. Oftentimes the young people, the young medical doctors, the young scientists are much more passionate than the established one, because to be frank, we who are established, we're invested in the status quo. And if we stay with the status quo, we will not make the change that is necessary. So we really need to work closely together across generations. Oftentimes the young people will be more passionate, so we will kind of follow their passion. And then you will see transformation. These all 3 things lead to transformational change.
Okay, now I would like to get back to the other speakers, whether they wish to make some addition now that they have heard. Of course, this session is quite diverse in the different. We wanted it to be quite diverse with some specific cases, some more global cases, more social, some more geopolitical, some more health related, etc. So if the speakers would like to have an additional comment on their field or on the other field, ask questions. Also, if the audience would like to ask any question, please, this is the right time for it.
Yes. Hi, Robert. Yeah,
Hi.
I would like to contribute to what Martin just said, and I do agree with Martin that because this field is complex and the impacts are as well wide-ranging and complex, I think the cooperation and collaboration across fields and stakeholders is absolutely important. and I do agree on encouraging the young generation and educating the right young generation. So maybe one of the efforts that we should put is that we educate healthcare, and we try to change and input the environment and climate change education becomes almost like a must subject for all the other subjects. So this education curriculum change and adaptation to increase the awareness in the young generation. So I completely agree, and I think there are some efforts to. I know that there is an international association for doctors, environmental sentinel doctors, to increase the awareness through the healthcare training for climate change, environmental health, and related issues. So just wanted to add to the points that Martin just mentioned.
I think you mentioned education, and I think this is extremely valuable because I mean we have a chapter actually in the HERA agenda on education, and I think there are major challenges for education because we are asking people to cooperate and collaborate in very different disciplines. So, but on the other hand, the technologies and the knowledge are so detailed now that you have to be good in your own discipline. So not only you have to be extremely good in one discipline, but you also have to understand and speak to the other discipline. And in addition to that, that's 2 dimensions already. And the third dimension is time, because knowledge is so much changing over time, so you have to adapt. So I think we have a really major challenge in how we do education, we understand education, we provide education. That's one of, I think, is the major challenges. What do the others think?
And I think I totally agree that it's so important to work across the disciplines, and it requires a lot of, you need to be very open, of course, to try and understand each other's language. You need to be humble, I think, about what you can contribute. In the Netherlands, we, especially on things like adaptation measures and mitigation measures, we're trying to get the health sector more involved, because that's often driven very much from an urban planning point of view, and people have some great ideas, but then they kind of forget that there might be unintended health consequences. So I know certainly at the regional level, our regional public health services are very much engaging with other levels of local and regional government to work together on ensuring that the measures that are put in place are good for everybody and don't have these unintended consequences. But it's very much kind of, it's keeping that dialogue open and trying to understand each other. And I think, some sectors, they have the models and everything. They know exactly how things work, and you could do a really quick risk assessment, for example, on water management. Water management in the Netherlands has been going for hundreds of years. But for health, it's so much more complex. We kind of need to understand the challenges that we face in our different disciplines. So I think it's just keeping that channel of communication open and being open to the difficulties we face and the things we can't quantify, for example.
In the last 2 years, we have done 2 big experiments. One is we have developed a master course together with the University of Munich, where we have students from up to 20 countries. It's a 1-week course, and it's really focusing on leading transformational change. And we had as speakers key guys like Nick Watts from Lancet Countdown, Andy Haynes, Sabine Gabrius, the best speakers you can get in the world, to give the input, to give perspective. But then they were developing projects in their own areas, kind of with a transformational lens. And through doing the project work and bringing the learning from the great experts together, they start seeing kind of what transformation is all about. And in addition, we have then done a lecture series where we reach up to 1,500 students, which is also focusing on the different lenses of planetary health, but then focuses on moving from knowledge to transformative action. So we invite every speaker to also point out what is the relevance of what you're doing to the transformation agenda. And I think this is the way in which we have to think about it, to speak about it, especially when we are uncomfortable with it, or we don't see yet how it gets practical. Then we really have to educate ourselves much more and share about kind of the things which are for us at the edge, because transformation is always at the edge. It's not in our comfort zone. And the interesting thing is when you work like this, it also gets very exciting and people are motivated because it serves our curiosity to go beyond boundaries. And so there's a lot of benefits coming from it.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from, is it Barnard? Would you want to state your question? Ooh, okay, otherwise I can read it, but it's better if you if you read it. And this is for Elizabeth, actually.
Hi, yeah, my name is Els. Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, we can hear you. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was wondering if you have any more data available about the link between the health effects that you talked about and socioeconomic backgrounds, because I think it's very important to always keep socioeconomic backgrounds in mind and how climate change and health effects affect people from different backgrounds in order, you know, in the keeping climate justice in mind and things like that.
Yeah, that's a good question, Els. It's not my particular background, but you know, we all know, of course, that health outcomes impacts are going to be mediated by socioeconomic differences in populations, and there's a lot of work being done on health inequalities. But how exactly that is linked to the health effects of climate change, I'm not sure if that's how much research has been done on that exact link. But certainly, you know, on in terms of inequalities and health impacts, there's a lot of work done on that. I don't know if anybody else can join in and is aware of any specific work on socioeconomic differences and climate change impacts. I can imagine, for example, that people well, I can actually think of a few examples. In cities, for example, people who are poorer are more likely to be impacted by the heat in cities. They have buildings which are more likely to retain heat, for example, and people with certainly in richer countries will have more access to air conditioning, for example. So that is certainly one with heat. And in terms of where one lives and maybe more exposed to extreme weather events like flooding, I'm not sure what the evidence is exactly on that, but certainly with heat, I know there's a difference in the cities. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought I could complement that, Elizabeth. I think that in the global level it's a bit more difficult because there are a lot of global analysis looking at climate change impacts such as heat, temperature, a cold or hot temperature. But because socioeconomic are such contextual factors, and so they are only able, I mean, there are regional or country-based analysis across many countries where you can see the kind of a country level socioeconomic disparities of climate change impacts. But when it comes to the socioeconomics that do explain that contextual inequalities due to climate change impacts, they are much more country-based, and they are data which are usually quite complex to collect, and you need a wealth of information to do that. So I'd say it's just kind of agreeing with Elizabeth that there are country-based heat waves and cold weather or flooding impacts where these data are possible, and there are global analyses where these data are much more blurry and kind of a country level socioeconomic disparities.
Okay.
Yeah, just to add to that, I know that in the US, in the recent heat waves, you see obviously people that are homeless, which luckily we don't see so much in the Netherlands, but they're much more likely to suffer the effects, morbidity effects of the heat. So especially the home, and obviously the cold as well, the cold snaps. Yeah.
Well, thank you. That's extremely relevant and very important, and it is addressed in the agenda. I would like to forward now a question from Katka to Dr. Boissier, Jérôme. She says, when you studied the disease in Corsica, have you tried the same survey in other rivers in France?
We looked for the presence of snail in France, and we did not find any snail in the south of France. But we lacked, when we have done this kind of studies or field studies, we lack a powerful tool to detect snail, because the traditional tool is using scoop on the river, and you can imagine that is very time consuming. It's a little bit impossible to detect snail in raw river or lake just using scoop. Is the reason why we have developed eDNA tool very recently. Thus now we have to identify potential transmission sites just with the presence of the snail using eDNA.
Okay.
But we did not detect positive patients in the continent.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's maybe the French eat the snails. You don't find them. I mean, that's.
But Bolimus snail are maybe half a centimeter snail, and is not very.
Not so good. Okay, I see. No, I mean, I think what you this is really important, and I think your talk shows that what's happening in Africa is really important for what's happening in Europe, because when we were writing the agenda and to see what we would like recommend, it's the EU, it's for the EU Commission, but we really mentioned the fact that we should not only focus on Europe, that what's happening elsewhere in the world is very important and very relevant. And this is what we show.
Know in Africa on this tropical disease is what we know in Africa is not so complex to decrease the prevalence to 50% to 1%. But the big difficulty is to go to 1% to elimination of a disease.
Mm-hmm.
And in Corsica, we have the same situation, but in the other side, we start by 1%. And we are in the same situation than in Africa with a lot of money. We are in France. Yes, we have a microscope to study the emergence of this tropical disease in Corsica, and really we do not understand all the things concerning reservoir holes, diagnostic, etc. Yes, you are true. This is very similar situations.
Yeah, and in fact, you gave one example on this tropical disease, but the real issue is that we have so many other examples on infectious diseases, waterborne or vector-borne, whatever, that will be very likely increase, and for which we don't, there are a lot of gaps in knowledge at many places. Yeah. So that's, I think, is a major point. Let me see. Maybe to Ariana, you mentioned, I mean, you have more work maybe on the drivers of immigration. Did you work also on the impact of this increased immigration in societies like in Europe? We know that.
No, we haven't done that kind of work yet. I mean, that's an issue as well, and I think it has been one of the kind of migrant stories for Europe and as a receiving point. But no, we haven't done anything. So our work is mainly focused so far in Malawi. So we're trying to understand what are the drivers in Malawi and trying to see whether we can predict those drivers. And hopefully we'll be able to produce a model which we can extrapolate elsewhere. So it will be climate change, link through food security, water security, and then how that creates pressures and stresses to vulnerability profiles, and then the decision to migrate. So the focus is in low income country.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is really important, because the examples on migration shows how much you can start from a physical problem like heat, drought, etc., and then you end up with, of course, a social health problem, social problem, and then political problem elsewhere. So that's I think a very good example that we should have a look, in a wider vision than what we usually have.
Yeah, I just want you to complement that one. Actually, just going slightly further, because we do see the migrants in Europe, and it's almost like a snapshot in time. So we just see them now, but based on evidence, and also the multifactorial conditions that push them out of their countries. It's a combination of social, economic, poverty, political, and environmental drivers, and climate change might have had potentially been playing a role in magnifying the risks of those drivers. So I mean, the Syrian Exodus is an example of that, where there is a publication. I know there has been, you know, criticized in different levels, but it's trying to explore, by Kelly et al. It's trying to explore that over 40-50 years of history of political, economic, leading to more recently to food insecurity, led to the massive displacement of Syrians, and then to the conflict, and then to the aftermath of that. So what we see in Europe, I think, you know, Europe has been, I think, you know, politically resistant, or I could say, you know, from certain country perspective, resistant towards migrants, but it's a multitude of factors that might have been long-term impacting these populations and the conditions that force them to leave their own countries. So climate change might have had a role in addition to these other complex factors over a long period of time. And I don't think we should say, you know, they're moving out for better economic reasons. I think, you know, it's way more complex than that. So that just complementing your.
I do think it's very important to start framing the climate crisis as a security issue, as a health issue, as a food security issue, because it is really not any longer an environmental issue. Yes, it is also an environmental issue, but it is kind of very much threatening the security of our lives. And only if we start these complexities, people will be willing to invest what it takes to get us to a safer place and take some of the risks out. Yeah, and I mean, if you talk to experts in external affairs, they all say, in a way, you know, pandemics and climate crisis and biodiversity crisis is now on the top of their agenda. Even for guys doing military strategy, it is on the top of their agenda because it's one of the highest risks we have for warfare. Yeah. So it's very important also when we are scientists to contextualize the science that we are doing in a certain field and then connect it to the larger picture, because that's a really interesting thing also from your examples, from the example from Corsica. You see it in all different areas, you see the small examples, and you can then tell the larger story from the small examples.
Yeah. This reminds me that there was a question for you also from Katka concerning the health impact of climate change. I mean, what made the health sector suddenly change and be aware? You said like 2-3 years ago, they started to be more aware of these issues. What in your opinion made them change? Is it the pandemic that suddenly, you know, made the people think about other crises?
It was before the pandemic. I think a big effect in Germany was the growth of the Fridays for Future movement. And in a way, we were starting in parallel. We did also actions on the street. We participated in their climate strikes. So I think the awareness in the public was rising, and then in one of the in some of the larger medical meetings, they started to then make resolutions, and we were doing also actions there and manifestations, and then we started to network the key players, and we started to network scientists to the doctors and to the doctor associations. So we were very strategic in connecting people. And from the beginning, we were kind of focusing on kind of bringing across all the necessary knowledge, all the available knowledge, but also connecting it then with transformative action. What can we do so that it is empowering and people start seeing what they can do? And over time now, this is developing a very strong dynamic in Germany. Then also the cooperation with the Lancet Countdown was critical because it allowed Germany to see that the science in this field is already clear. We have to continue science, but we don't have to wait for action. We have enough science to do the action. And so to be connected with them, to cooperate, to do public statements with them, to do policy briefs with them, was giving the whole movement quite a big growth in reputation and also understanding that we really work closely together with the best scientists in the world on resolving and making progress with this.
This is so very true. I mean, in very often, I sometimes had, you know, I'm a research person, and sometimes I'm speaking to some of these, you know, policymakers or deputies, and I try to convince them that there is no contradiction between research and action. It's the opposite. And that
Yes.
because sometimes they say, let's stop doing research and act now, which is okay. They should act now, but that we shouldn't stop doing research, because with research now, we are acting like in 5 years from now. So, I mean, there's no contradiction.
There's one more thing which was very lucky. We were lucky to get the best two science communicators in Germany kind of on board with us. So one is kind of the David Attenborough of Germany. He's an astrophysicist. He's doing all the, in television, all the shows on science, and he works now closely with me. He's a very close friend now, and we constantly work on how can we do talks together? Who can we influence? And then the other is a medical doctor. He's a comedian, but also a moderator and a science communicator. So they have ways to reach millions of people on this subject. And they are constantly together. We are looking at how can we narrate the story? How do we communicate? What is a good way of doing it? And for example, Harald, this astrophysicist, was saying, when he's doing the science and I talk about the health and the transformative action, people get it. He cannot do it on his own. He needs the health examples. Then people start seeing, oh, it's about myself. It's about my kids.
Yeah, I think, yeah, you're absolutely right. We have actually a specific subchapter on risk communication in HERA, because we were aware this is so much important. And concerning risk communication, I would like to address one of the comments that here from Martin, saying that we should not speak about climate change, but rather climate crisis or breakdown or emergency. I think, yeah, I mean, climate crisis would be, reasonable now. I think no problem. Okay, so it's fine with me. We can, but I think you don't change your words so easily. But I think it makes sense to speak about climate crisis these days. So, thanks, Martin, for your comment. Are there any other comments from the audience or from the speakers? Would like to add something before we close? Trying to see if. Okay.
I have one interesting development from the University in Munich, and you might not be aware. In Germany, there was a call for a proposal by the Volkswagen Foundation for a huge call, many millions, on science communication. And all big science centers were participating. So through this friend of mine, who is this astrophysicist, he is at the University of Munich, and they were asking him, so can you participate? What should we do? At the end, they were using the planetary health story as their main framing, not just for the health sector, but for all science. And they made their pitch, and they won the thing. So now we have a science communication lab at the University of Munich focusing on planetary health. So I think this is very important for all of you, because when you do your projects in HERA and so on and so forth, there's always the question, how do we communicate it? But it's an interesting shift that guys from all the different disciplines see how they actually can work on communicating science through this lens and narrative of planetary health. And it's also very important for us to understand we need to talk to the economists, to the sociologists, to the biologists, to everyone involved, because they all have topics within their science that is related to what we're talking about.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think Martin is really also, I think that planetary health is a good concept and framework. Yes, because we include many other things like water scarcity and loss of biodiversity. Let me try to close. I think we have, I mean, we mentioned the multidisciplinarity. This is what we have tried to do here, having, people involved in many different aspects, the health aspect, the epidemiology, health, the infectious disease, social sciences, communication, and transformative action. So I think this is all about the impacts of climate change, but more generally all about the impacts of environmental change or crisis that we are facing these days. I think we need really multidisciplinarity. HERA is really about the research. As I said, this does not mean that action cannot be taken now. This is for decision maker, but we need more research because there are some gaps, and I think we can convince better people if we provide additional robust information on what they may be facing and how we can try to mitigate or how to adapt to these different crises. So with that, I really think we had a very nice session. I would like really to thank you again, thank the audience, and I hope we will see you in another webinar on HERA that we will announce soon. Maybe we have already announced it, but we will keep on announcing soon on some other important topics. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to the colleagues for the great presentations.